supposed to see,
all
but
the
it's
emails.
not until January 31st. She's getting married. And it's going to be in San Francisco. So that's, of course, Nancy Bruce will be there. So, I don't know. I don't know about yet. But anyway, so that's the latest. Oh, Rachel Williams. How's that? Someone that's, you may or may not know, she's moved away, so you may
I've
not
been
know.
here since 2014.
Yeah, you probably don't know Rachel.
Right.
She's in college.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, she's in college, so you.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Deb. Thank you. Keep me posted.
Yeah, I will.
He likes, I don't know why. Sometimes
I don't know why either.
sometimes you wear pants, but you like to wear shirts. Okay, I'm talking about boxers. I'm talking about pants, dry pants, like my pants. Okay, I'm sorry, I know that's funny. You like to wear shorts, which I am bundled up. Okay,
He enjoys the attention.
I cannot wear shorts right now.
Most people can.
No.
My top half more.
Okay, I know. See, I can't do it.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Okay, I know.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. He was Chris Byron. So.
Well, coming up in about 6 weeks.
I think I might turn the heat up a little. I'm breathing. Ooh.
I don't want to.
I'm sorry if you're cold. It's going to warm up in here.
Where's the
I'm getting it. I'm sorry. We were having a little kitchen.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll be all right.
What? Oh, thank you.
It's always a great dinner. Yeah, it's not gonna stay. I wanted to be sure not to have you miss out on my stove.
Would you all mind if I just ran to the restroom really quick? Okay. I'll be right back. I'm just going to wait for Dawn and Lee, and they're right behind me. We have the sign-up sheet going around. Okay. Hi, Hal. And if you weren't in here before, I told you if you're cold, it's going to warm up. I forgot to come up and turn the heat up, so it will warm up. All right. Is there anybody here tonight who hasn't been here other weeks? No, like at all. Lori, you have not been here other weeks?
I wasn't here 2 weeks ago.
Oh, but you were here. Were you here any other of the weeks?
I've been to
You have been to other. Okay, got it. All right. Well, welcome. This is week. Oh, come on in. Week 4. Week 4. I know, we're on our 4th hour. And I was having a really hard time this week figuring out how to cram everything in to this week. So some of it is kind of not left out completely, but some of it's going to have to be next week too. So don't forget to come back. I was telling Laura today that tonight's good, but next week is what I'm actually really excited about, because we're going to really talk about, okay, we've learned all this, where are we going with it? You know, what are we going to do about it? Doctrine of discovery and all that goes with it. Sorry, I got a point. I'm not doing something right. There we go. So our land acknowledgement for the evening. Tonight we are gathered on the traditional homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa. They were stewards of the land long before Arlington Heights was settled by European immigrants. And I think this is really important for tonight as we talk about some of the, what we call more modern day issues, land issues that we've had with Native Americans. And I wanted to mention that I looked, today and tomorrow is actually a tribal summit in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of tribal leaders are actually in Washington, D.C. President Biden spoke to them this afternoon. But the interesting part, the reason that I first knew about it was because I subscribed to Native News Online. It's a good, if you're interested in this topic, you can get it to your inbox every morning, and it has really good stories across tribes. They cover everything. And that's how I knew about it. And so I decided to go and see if any of it was on like the major news sources this afternoon, and it wasn't, which was a little disappointing. Maybe tonight it will be by tonight, but it definitely was not during the afternoon. I went on to see if maybe they were covering President Biden's speech or something like that, but I didn't see anything. So, but that is going on. And unfortunately, I also read that Deb Haaland, who we talked about last week, of course, this summit in D.C. would be one of her big things, and she has COVID this week. I know. So she's having to attend virtually. I tell you. So just a review of what the doctrine of discovery is, the theological, philosophical, and legal framework that dates all the way back to the 15th century. So it's not something new. It's quite old, but it's been embedded in a lot of our laws, and not just laws, but just people's ways of thinking. But it's allowed the invasion and the seizing of indigenous lands, really throughout the world, not just the United States. So I was just thought that we would start tonight with any reflections that you might have on our first 3 weeks together. Anything? I'm gonna get the microphone. Is it okay, Jonah, to use it? Okay. I'm gonna get the microphone so that everybody can hear you. I'll ask you to pass it in.
I've been here on and off, and, I've been hearing on and off in Illinois. I never knew that Maryville, not now, but in the 1800s, that Maryville was a Indian boarding school. Not now, because I don't know how.
Right. Yeah, they do a lot of different things. That's actually where Viator House is located.
Yeah, but not now, but in the 1800s before Maryville, I never knew that.
You know what? Neither did I.
And that's and it's kind of interesting. It really is.
Right.
Yeah.
It's good to learn our history that we
Yes, it
didn't
is.
know.
That's just, yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I've talked about this before, but I'd certainly changed the way we celebrated Thanksgiving this year. So yeah, and I've talked about that previously, so I won't go into it again. But I won't ever think about Thanksgiving in quite the same way again, I think.
I think I've learned that the arrogance and the presumption of people is breathtaking. And it's nothing new. I think that we can be pretty miserable creatures sometimes.
Not always, but we
Did I
can
say all
be
of us?
sometimes all
I didn't
of us,
say all
I
of us.
think.
Oh yeah, we're awful. Yeah. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Anybody else?
that's my thought.
Looking at the doctrine, I'm starting to think, does it apply just to Christians running into indigenous people who aren't Christians? Or is it also somewhat of the conflict we're seeing over in Israel versus the Palestinians? Is
Yes.
this the way people just think?
It's that colonialism mindset, I deserve this land, I'm going in and I'm taking it. So you're seeing the same type of colonialism there. And I know it's, once again, also a very difficult topic.
Very.
Anybody else? If you just came in, we're just reflecting on our past 3 weeks, if anybody has anything they want to say. Oh, in the back. Okay.
The first week we was here, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, but what stood out for me most was when you talked about the long walk. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Yes, so that still resonates inside of me today. It broke my heart.
I think that the long walk also for me, that was when I learned more about the long walk, that really got me. I like I told you then, I knew about the Trail of Tears, but I didn't know about the long walk. And yeah, that was really eye-opening for me. Anybody else have anything they want to say? Don't worry, I have more times for questions. Thank you. I wanted to, so while I was kind of preparing for this class today, where we're going to start off talking a little bit about how do you be Native American and Christian? And how, because we know what happened, right? Because we've been learning about it when missionaries went in and the U.S. government paid churches to convert people to Christianity. So we saw what happened, and people became Christian. And then how do they do that? And there are a lot of very faithful Native American Christians, Presbyterians, Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists. And how do those things, in our traditional way of thinking about God and creation, how does that go together? Like, why? So Mark Charles, he wrote the book that I have up there in the middle, Unsettling Truths. And he often talks about, because people always ask him, so you tell us all these terrible things that people did in the name of the church and Christianity, how in the world can you be a Christian? And so he talks about that. We're going to be talking about it a little. But I was doing some reading, trying to figure out, because I told you my, however far back, grandfather I think 3 generations, was a Presbyterian minister, Native American. So I was reading up on him a little bit. There actually is a book about him and that somebody in the family wrote. And so I was reading some of that, and then some of his documents are in historical places. So I was able to find one. I'm going to do my best to read it to you because I think it gives us sets a tone for how do you be Christian and Native. And so we're talking back in the 1800s, where that version of Christianity was, the missionaries came in and they converted people to Christianity, kind of our traditional type of Christianity. Then there was kind of, in the 1900s, in the boarding schools, it became, very terrible. And now we're kind of seeing a resurgence of Native American, because early in the 1900s, you couldn't be Native and Christian. Like that, you couldn't do that. Now, present day, that you can do that. And so we're going to hear a couple different things. I have a woman that I met that I couldn't find a live video, so we're going to listen to a podcast of her talking for a couple minutes. But I want to try and read this to you because I found it just by chance. But the problem is the writing is from the 1800s, and I can't figure out some of the words. And yes, Elaine. Oh my goodness. I might be able to figure that out, but probably not tonight. I'm sorry. I'll see what I can do and tell you on Sunday. How's that? All right. So this was written when I think it's my great-great-great-grandfather, maybe only great-great, actually. I don't know. When he passed away. And it was a commendation to him from the National Council of Churches. But the National Council of Church has received with profound emotion official intelligence through official message from the principal chief of the death of our honorable fellow citizen, the Reverend Stephen Foreman of Park Hill, this nation. Reverend Foreman died at his home at Park Hill Thursday the 7th at 8:00 p.m. and will be buried in the mission burial grounds there today. As advised, he has attained to the patriarchal age of 74 years. The immediate cause of death was paralysis. He was born in the old Cherokee Nation east of the Mississippi River, on or about the year 1807, and listen to this part, he emigrated to this country with the nation in its forced removal in 1837 to 1838, acting as the conductor of one of our detachments. He took active faith in effecting the reunion of the Eastern and Western Cherokees in 1839, and was one of the signers to the Act of the Union and the Constitution then adopted by the Cherokees at their convention at the old campground in this place. He became a convert, so this was the part, he became a convert to the Christian religion and at once found employment with the missionaries of the American Board, laboring among the Cherokees to better his life, for the better of his life's work. He spent a year or more at the Presbyterian Theological Seminary at Princeton, New Jersey. On returning home, he at once became associated with the Reverend Sam Worcester in the work of translating and interpreting and preaching the Word of God in Cherokee at the Park Hill Mission Station. He he labored till the death of Mr. Worcester and the suspension of the mission. Remember, we talked about how the missions came in and then they were gone. This was of great, the war, here's another one. The War of the Great Rebellion forced him from his home, the Civil War. But once it was over, he at once returned home and resumed work under the auspices of the Presbyterian Church South. In this connection, he labored until, frustrated by paralysis and old age, realizing that his life work was coming to a close, he calmly resigned. And then worked with the home board of the Presbyterian Church United States. For 2 years, he has been faithfully waiting for the messenger of death, which here at last has come to his relief. We recognize the fact that a father has fallen, and that a good man and true patriot has gone to rest. So in recognition of that, be it resolved by the National Council that in the death of Reverend Stephen Foreman, we recognize the life of one of our oldest and best citizens, a true patriot, a devoted Christian, minister, an affectionate father, a warm-hearted friend, and a zealous defender of all that is pure, good, and noble in human society. And I've read it pretty well tonight, but the first time I read that, I just cried. Because that really, I just came across it by chance as I was trying to find out, how do you do both of these things? And so, obviously he lived a long time ago, but I said, I wish I could have talked to him. Would have been great. I know this is little writing, so I thought the easiest place for us to start is really to talk about the creation stories. And I think how many people have kind of heard Native American creation stories? There's lots of them out there, right? All the tribes have their own creation story, just like we do, just like every other faith tradition has a creation story. But when we think about it, even in Genesis, there's 2 creation stories, right? So there's one in Genesis 1, one in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, and anybody can say, when people are created, what's kind of a key there for how we would be seeing the land? Anybody? That's in 2, I think. From the dirt? Yeah, in 2. But in 1, to have dominion over. And so if you read that, then, we're better than the land, right? In 2, though, yes, out of the dirt, we're created. If we looked at it that way, and then we looked at some of the Native American creation stories, who really see God, their creator, as part of the land. So they're not separate. People, the creator, the animals, the land, everything is living, even rocks. So remember when I told you about in the Navajo Nation where there are 4 sacred mountains? Those are living things. Those were created as living things. They were not just rocks that you could go in and bulldoze down. So when we talk about some of our land issues that we've had, whereas we maybe think of ourselves as we own the land, and we still think we have to take care of it often, not always the best, but we think we should. We don't have that sense of it being a living, breathing thing. Susan?
I loved learning that just a few years ago, a one-cell
Right. It's so interesting. When I went to the Navajo Nation, and we were sorry, I lost my thought, but when we were where their government buildings are in their capital, we drove in, and there were just these huge rocks around it, and I thought, wow. And I said, well, gosh, these rocks are kind of cool, just right outside your building. And he said, well, if we didn't need to tear down the rock, we wouldn't. Like, they're part of the earth. We would not do that. How many people, we hear of tribes, they have animals that are kind of seen as, how many people have thought that tribes see animals as gods? Or have you heard that before? Right. But really what they're doing is it's respect for the Creator. And so those animals, so wolves, bears, eagles, but they're not worshiping the animals. They are worshiping the Creator by respect for anything that was created. So I'm wondering that if we were to look at creation more that way, how might that affect our view as caretakers of the land and animals and people? Or perhaps you're already good with seeing it that way. Right. Which is what happened with the doctrine of discovery, because that traditional Christian way of looking at creation of land, you can just go in and take it. The only thing that really matters are the people. And that in native spirituality, that just is not true. Everything is connected to each other. Everything matters. As Susan was talking about, even rocks matter. And is there anybody here who is a lover of collecting rocks? I have a daughter who loves rocks. And rocks, yes? And she, tells me all the time, you need to put this rock in your pocket today. I'm like, okay. Okay. See what's next. Oh, so I just did a couple slides looking at the traditional, this isn't necessarily what each one of us thinks, but the traditional view of Christians' view of relationship to nature was that God commissioned us to rule over creation in a way that sustains, protects, and enhances God's work, so that all creation may fulfill the purposes God intended. But basically, we are the boss. We must manage the environment not simply for our own benefit, but for God's glory. Now, not necessarily if we were to look at that, as stewards of everything, that would be okay. But when we start to look at it as we are the power, that's where we run into the conflict. Whereas an indigenous view of nature, many indigenous people, so remember, we have over 500 tribes in the United States. So there's many different creation stories, many different traditions, cultures. But in general, they believe the natural world is sacred. They consider themselves as one element of the natural world. So we're just like one little piece of all of these things that were created, and that it needs to be whole for future generations. Generally speaking, they see themselves then as stewards of the land, and all land. much land that is sacred. So we're going to be talking about some places that ran into some real problems because companies wanted to come in and just go through that land that they considered sacred. And I'm sure many of you have heard those stories in the news as that happens. Oh, is it going to start right away or should I wait? Okay. So as we talk about how do you blend these two things together? And I personally don't think it's too hard after talking with some people. I think that for Native Americans, I see that how it may, I always am wondering, like, how do you look at your past and think, and all the terrible things that happened in the name of Christianity, how does that work? And then how do you stay faithful to the church? We're going to listen, I'll tell you about this woman in a minute, but one of the things that I found is that we also read the Bible in our way, in our culture. So we read the Bible, we read the Old Testament, the Israelites went into the Promised Land, the Israelites went in and they pushed the people out and they took over. And all of those things, and then we're able to justify things we do. There actually is a Native American version of the Bible out now that you can get it in English. That writes it a little bit differently. So just some of the words are a little bit differently, written a little different. So that maybe the perspective, and from what I've read, that when you read it from your cultural context, you're able to blend those things together. One of the things that has happened now is that rather than the boarding schools who said you cannot be Native, forget your language, forget everything, now there's much more blending of those cultures. So if you go, I told you there's 95 Native American Presbyterian churches in the United States. And if you go to those churches, they're very faithful, even faithful Presbyterians, follow the Book of Order, do all that good stuff. But they also now are starting to bring in some of their native culture. And I think it's really beautiful to be able to do that. So Reverend Martha, we're going to listen to, it's about 3 minutes of a podcast, and I just couldn't find a video with her live. I met her this spring. She is the pastor at Central Presbyterian Church in Phoenix, Arizona. It's an urban Native American church, one of the only ones. So it's not of a particular tribe. Anybody can go there. I don't even think you have to be Native American, but I think most of the people are. And she's been there. She grew up in this church and then went away to seminary and did some other things, and now she's been back, I think, for about 20 years. She is a wonderful defender of the faith, but also a wonderful defender of Native American culture. And she talks for a couple minutes here. She tells a story about how she is able to blend these two things. So do I hit it or do you? Me? Okay, so I apologize I couldn't get her live, but I think you'll enjoy listening to her. And the beginning is an introduction of her by these two men that do this podcast. If you ever are looking for a fun podcast, they have some good stuff. Okay.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to A Matter of Faith, a Presby podcast, the podcast where we respond to your questions of faith, justice, and church life. Don't forget to write in and send us your questions. Why should they do that, Lee?
Because, Simon, if it matters to you who are writing questions, then it matters to us, and it just might be a matter of faith, and it probably will be. And Simon, if you could see into the future, what are you doing on vacation?
Sorry.
I'm either on a boat, I'm on the beach, or I'm asleep.
Same. I'm probably not on a boat, but I will be hiking and looking at the nature, looking at God's creation. And that's probably what I'm doing this week. But just to remind everyone, Simon and I, we love you, but we're also on vacation. And so this week, our episode is not going to feature us much, but it is going to feature a wonderful guest.
Yeah, and actually it's kind of interesting. This episode that you're listening to now has come out just after July 4th, or also known as the 4th of July, which in the United States we say is Independence Day. But we're going to interrogate some of that history in the United States a little more closely, particularly going back to things like colonization, because we're going to be talking about the experiences of Native Americans, and particularly our Native American churches. And joining us for a wonderful conversation is the Reverend Martha Sadonge, who is the pastor of Central Presbyterian Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and she is also consultant to the Presbytery of Grand Canyon for Native American ministries for the Southern churches. So we hope that you enjoy the conversation with Martha. Well, joining us on this episode of A Matter of Faith, a Presby podcast, is a very special guest. Joining us is Reverend Martha Sadonge, the pastor of Central Presbyterian Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and consultant to the Presbytery of Grand Canyon for Native American ministries, particularly for the Southern churches. Martha, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here. You know, another example of that is on my father's side, the Kiowa side, there's the oldest dance that we have as Kiowa people is the gourd dance. And it's held, there's a gourd clan society that holds their dances every July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Has nothing to do with Independence Day, trust me. But it has everything to do with the calendar and the sun, because that time of year is when traditionally the Kiowas would have their sun dance. But when that was outlawed and that dance could no longer take place, they went back to the next oldest dance, which was the gourd dance. So every July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, Kiowas come from all over to Carnegie, Oklahoma, to participate in these dances, which are very spiritual. They're healing songs, they're powerful songs. And I remember one time going back with my cousin, and we had gone to church that Sunday morning, and there was a native pastor there, and he offered communion and was glad to be there. It was at the Rainy Mountain Iowa Indian Baptist Church. It's not a Southern Baptist church, it's an American Baptist church. And so we had communion, and then that afternoon we went to the dance grounds for the start of the gourd dances. And to hear the strong singing taking place, to see all the men and their gourds, and to hear them shake, and to hear and feel the cool breeze, I just got the shivers. And it's that same kind of shivers that I get when I know it's the Spirit that's moving within me. And my cousin even felt it, and she leaned over to me and she said, "Boy, can you feel the Spirit?" I said, "You can." I said, "And the Spirit is so thick." I said, "And it is the same Spirit that was at the table this morning when we took communion." And then she said, "Look," and she pointed out into the arena. And there was the pastor dancing in his regalia for the gourd dance. And I said to her, "See, this is what it's about. There is no choice. It's one and the same Spirit. It moves us to feel it here in this place with these songs, with the powerful singing of the men, and the powerful dancing that is going on. It's one and the same for us as Native people."
And thank you to Jonah for figuring out how to get part of a podcast into my presentation. Oh my. I loved meeting Reverend Martha. She was If they have a Facebook page, so you can actually watch their services. She's just something else. And that podcast is actually much longer than that. It was almost an hour. So we've blended all of these spiritual practices. We have Native Americans who are going to church now and bringing their native culture into the churches, yet still, we are still using our old policies that we have to trample on their lands, their sacred lands. So still, even though, when I look at it, even though Native Americans have somehow, many of them found out how to be part of these churches and their culture, we still are going in and all of these things. So I picked you can go online and find so many land water issues. We saw it in Killers of the Flower Moon, for those of you who have recently seen that movie. We saw what happened there. So I picked four, and then one more kind of big topic at the end. Four stories that I thought might resonate with people, things that you might want to learn more about. But the first one is the Colorado River water rights. And you can't really see the picture in the background, but this picture is Chinle, Arizona. 40% of the people in Chinle do not have running water. I mean, actually 40% of the Navajo Nation do not have running water, even though the Colorado River is right there. And the Navajo have land rights and water rights to the river. But there has never been they've never settled how that works. And so 40% of people, I mean, could you imagine if 40% of the people in Arlington Heights did not have running water? I mean, that to me, how many of you, I know some of you have watched Basketball or Nothing, and you saw the kids who have to get up in the morning and do what?
Take their ducks out, 5 o'clock in the morning with family, fill up giant drums of water, haul it back to the livestock and for themselves.
Yep.
Before they go to school.
Before they go to school.
Probably every day.
And then we wonder why there's poverty, addictions, violence, all of those things. You're right. There's many places. So, I mean, obviously we're just focusing on this, but this is not like just the United States issue. So the Navajo Nation, 1868, remember we talked about that, the Long Walk, and then the treaty, so they returned to their homeland, which is now today the Navajo Nation. 40%, no running water. There was actually a very recent Supreme Court case, and you may or may not have actually heard that one in the news, but the decision was, I believe, 5-4, so it was close, but 5-4 that actually said that the federal government does not, even though the treaty, the original 1868 treaty said that the federal government has to supply water for the Navajo Nation. The Supreme Court has ruled very recently that they're not under obligation to plan for future needs of water. So, once again, complicated, but maybe not. When you have people living in the United States who don't have running water, and there is water available, maybe we need to figure that out. But the Supreme Court did rule not in the Navajo Nation's favor. If you're interested in learning more about that, I do recommend Native News Online. They really have a lot of information on these types of things. So that's one. How many people have heard about that at all? In the background, this was actually Chinle right after they had a huge flood. But, flood water doesn't help you so much, so. The Gila River. Does anybody know where the Gila River is? There is part of it, Arizona. Right, so south of Phoenix. That area was actually inhabited by what they call the bearded people, 300 BC. And they were very sophisticated farmers. They built, it's desert land, but the Gila River did provide water for them. And they built canals, all these things to keep the water going, to keep their farming going. Until the Spaniards came up from Mexico, European settlers, all of the land rush, the mining, all of the things that you could find. And the tribe is called the Acamel Otham tribe. They were living there, and the settlers that came in actually changed the flow of the Gila River so that the water would flow up towards Phoenix. And suddenly the people in the Gila River Valley, where there is today a Presbyterian church, there was a Presbyterian mission, beautiful little church, and they have, I meant to put a picture on here, they have the cutest little fellowship hall building with a kitchen, and they have, maybe I'll bring it next week, they have the cutest little sign, you can imagine that I love this, that said, church kitchen, painted on the outside, and it was just so cute. Lovely people. So for years, though, they did not have enough water. In 2004, there was an agreement reached that changed, they built some more canals and changed the flow of the river back and came to an agreement with them. So that was a good story of working towards getting more water to that land, because it doesn't rain there very much. So that was a huge issue. If you ever are in Phoenix, it's just south. You can drive through. It's really beautiful. I got pointed at Oak Flat. How many people have heard about Oak Flat? So Oak Flat has actually recently been in the news. And Oak Flat is an Apache sacred ground. And the U.S. government is trying to sell that land and allow copper mining. This is east or west of Phoenix. I can't remember. So the Presbyterian Church has actually been involved in some of the protesting for Oak Flat, and really you can actually go on the Peace USA mission website and read about Oak Flat. But it's an Apache sacred ground, and if they allow the copper mining on this land, what happens to their sacred ceremonies? They can't have them. So that, here's another example of our old policies, that it looks like we're trying, we've got this, Native Americans trying to be a part of these churches and things like that, bring their culture in, but still we have, where we're not allowing their religious ceremonies. Does anybody remember the last eclipse when they actually closed down part in the Navajo Nation, which I thought was kind of great, so that there couldn't just be hordes of us going in to the area to see the eclipse. I don't know if anybody remembers seeing that on the news, but it was just probably a month ago, 2 months ago. I thought I had one more. Oh, yes. Oh, that's right. But there's an area out in... Right. But remember, if we're talking about Native American culture, right, then the sun is very important. The sun, the moon, all of those things are very important. So this one, I think how many people saw the movie Oppenheimer? Quite a few. So the basics probably of this, but in 1942, the U.S. government forcibly removed families to build Los Alamos and the National Laboratory. I think that the movie, some people complained about the movie, But if you really, it was supposed to be a movie about Oppenheimer, not about Native Americans. So but what I think it did, just like Killers of the Flower Moon, was bring this topic to light and got people to think about how did that work, because they were saying nobody lived there. But actually the Tewa people did live there, and they were forcibly, at gunpoint, removed from that land. So that uranium mines, and you can drive through there even today outside of Los Alamos and see where all the uranium mining has been done. Many Tewa people then ended up working in the laboratory in the uranium mines and suffered a lot of health consequences to that. In addition, in 1945, we all have learned about the bombing in Japan. But the part they leave out is when they tested it in the United States, just south of Los Alamos at the Trinity site, because they said that it was not populated. But really it was. And I actually heard somebody speak about her family. Every generation has had cancer, everybody. Yes.
Kind of like 3 Mile Island.
Yes, same idea. Yep. But this was, they just said nobody lived there, so it didn't matter. Yes, Susan.
My sister-in-law's family is from there. They've had cancer for 3 generations.
Right. Yeah. It's they are starting. There's been a lot. There is a fund that is supposed to help with financial support, but it takes a long time to get money. It doesn't always probably come through. One of the things that happened after the explosion was that all the tiny pieces of colored glass went all over. Native Americans do very beautiful beadwork and clothing work, and they saw this, and they went in and they picked it all up, not knowing that it was all radioactive. Took it home. People had wedding dresses that were beaded in the radioactive until the U.S. government figured out that. Yes, we do, quite often. We'll learn next week when we're going to talk about where do we go from here. I'll tell you a little bit more about Tewa Women United, that's doing a lot of work in this area. So we have all these. Does anybody have any others that they would like to share with us? Any? Okay. But, you can go online and find just all kinds of these types of issues. But these land issues, because of the boarding schools, all these things that we've talked about, now we have people who often we don't think about, right? We just, unless we come to, you're sitting here every Wednesday and hearing about this. So now, oh gosh, I had not really thought about reservations and what it's really like. But all these land issues, boarding school trauma, lead to poverty, hunger, food deserts. There's not, big Jewels and Mariano's on every corner on a reservation. You often have to drive pretty far. But then what happens? You go to Speedway, you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and Burger King, and that's what you eat. Or you go to the convenience store. And so there is a huge movement right now because of the land, gardening and things, trying to get back to those native roots. It takes a long time when we've tried to rip all that away from people. And so that's a lot of hard work for people on the reservations to do that. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's okay. So lack of water, we talked about that. And then one of the huge problems because of poverty and violence and addictions is this issue of missing, murdered, and indigenous women. There are thousands of women missing on reservations. Is the video next, Jonah? Okay. I have a short video for you to watch, and then we'll talk as much as we can. I know it's getting late. But we can pick it up next week, too. We'll have time. But this is on every reservation, even in urban areas. Because one thing we didn't talk about was in the 1950s, there was a movement to move people off of reservations and into urban areas. Places like Chicago, Minneapolis, San Francisco, to move people there. So there's actually the American Indian Center in downtown Chicago, was the first urban Indian center, still operating today. Many, many people, and until pretty recently, not a lot of work done to try and fix it. So we're going to watch just a short video.
Since she was first reported missing in Wyoming earlier this month until her remains were found later, the case of 22-year-old Gabby Petito has captured widespread media attention. But tens of thousands of people are reported missing or murdered every year in the U.S., and people of color don't get nearly the same level of attention, particularly Indigenous and Native Americans. Amna Nawaz has our conversation.
Judy, in Wyoming alone, 710 Indigenous people were reported missing between 2011 and 2020. In fact, although Indigenous people make up only 3% of the state's population, they accounted for more than 21% of homicide victims over the last decade. And the problem is not limited to Wyoming. Native women are murdered at rates 10 times the national average, a pattern that's reflected in a report from Abigail Echo Hawk. She's the Chief Research Officer for the Seattle Indian Health Board and the Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. She joins me now. Abigail, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you for making the time. You have called it a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Just give us a sense of scale and scope. What are we talking about?
We're talking about a crisis that didn't just start 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but one that has started and has been going on for more than hundreds of years. We have seen Native women go missing and murdered at astronomical rates, but despite knowing this within our communities and having the stories, we see an underreporting of them in the data, which makes it harder for us to advocate for and to show the disparity that exists in our communities and the loss of our loved ones.
Tell me why that underreporting is happening. What part of the system is failing?
In 2018, my organization put out a report in which we found that law enforcement agencies were either not collecting race and ethnicity of victims. We found database systems that would default to white if race and ethnicity wasn't collected, or they would visually look at somebody and decide what their race and ethnicity is. And as a result of that, we are finding a complete underreporting. And in fact, I've actually seen Native families having to fight to have their young relatives classified correctly because somebody mistook them for another race and they weren't reported as American Indian or Alaska Native. It's a systematic problem, and as a result of that, we have all of the stories of our communities, but we fight to show it in the data.
Tell me about what you hear from families about their missing loved ones, their murdered loved ones. What kind of stories do you hear from them about the issues they run into in reporting this and in getting justice?
We often will hear stories of individuals who attempt to report their loved ones missing, and officers will tell them, well, maybe she just ran away. Was she out drinking? Does she do sex work? We see the prejudices and stereotypes against Indigenous peoples and people of color play out in the underreporting because nobody's listening to us. We also see a maze of jurisdiction that exists only for Indigenous peoples in this country because of the laws that exist on tribal lands. I worked with a family where they actually spent 3 days of law enforcement trying to decide who had jurisdiction. And in that 3 days, their loved one remained missing and nobody was looking for them.
You mentioned these jurisdictional issues, and a lot of people think, well, that's just limited to when you're talking about tribal lands versus non-tribal lands. But your report was based on 71 urban cities across 29 states. So is this an issue regardless of where you live?
Absolutely. And we see this systematic issue playing out as a result of institutional and structural racism. In 2018, I put out another report related to high rates of sexual violence against American Indian, Alaska Native women in the city of Seattle. Out of the 94% of the women we talked to, 94% of them had been sexually assaulted in their lifetime, but only 8% of them saw a conviction of their rapist within the justice systems. We see a lack of accountability. We see a lack of investigation. And again, the systematic issues that place the blame of our victimization on our community instead of looking at why are we being targeted and why are we being victimized at such high rates.
Abigail, we're talking about this because of this intense media interest in the case of Gabby Petito. It's part of what our late news hour anchor colleague Gwen Eiffel once referred to as missing white women's syndrome, right? The spotlight that's granted to white women, but not often to women of color. Your organization has actually studied that, right? The comparison between how these stories are treated. What did you find?
In our report, we actually found of the cases that we looked at, 95% of them weren't covered in the media. And this didn't mean that there weren't videos. It didn't mean that there wasn't active ways to put this in the media. It's just nobody's cared. And I actually contributed to the report in Wyoming that showed more than 700 people missing. And that report, which came out in January of this year, again, had very little coverage. And as the Indigenous community, we mourn for the family of anybody whose loved one goes missing and murdered. But what we demand is equity in this kind of coverage because the lives of our women also matter.
In just a few seconds we have left, what does it take to fix this, to change this?
We need to see not only media coverage, but we need to see changes in policies. We need to see programming and interventions to understand that as Native women and Native people, we aren't at higher risk of going missing and murdered because there's something wrong with us. We are at higher risk because there are systems of inequity in this country that place us at higher risk. And those are the systems we have to address. And it's going to take the entire community of the United States to come together and do that with us.
That is Abigail Echo Hawk, Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute, joining us tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So this is just, I know from reservations I've been on, every family is impacted by somebody who is either missing right now or was missing, many not found. And a lot of it does have to do with jurisdiction, especially on tribal land. For crimes like this, the FBI can come in and help, but sometimes that's slow to happen. Lee? Mm-hmm.
They were the last two people to see her. They found her car maybe 20 miles from where she lived. And the local law enforcement, no one wanted to help them at all. And it was just ridiculous because what ended up happening, they found the young girl in her car. They stuffed her, they shot her. The guy was a woman in them. They only charged the female with murder, but the female tried to say that the man who was with her raped her, but she had been decomposing in her car for about a week or so, so they couldn't really get any DNA to prove that he did this, but this other woman beat her and stuffed her in her own car that was found alongside of her, and took her family to even check the car. He said they to the surrounding areas, the surrounding neighborhood, and no one thought to check the car. She could have been found way sooner.
Yeah.
Just the mere fact that it took maybe 2 days prior to before they found her, before law enforcement decided, and this was with the Native American authorities. No one helped this family. So I see that that's a big problem. No one helps them at all. It's like they have to do it themselves to try and formulate like search parties and so on and so forth in order to find the missing people.
Right. And we saw, I picked that particular news clip on purpose because I think we all remember the Gabby Petito story. is on the news every day. There are some new laws that they're working on. One is called the Not Invisible Act, and the other one is called Savannah's Law. And these laws they're starting to help a little bit, but there is a lot of work to do in this area. But these laws are starting to help in the collection of, like Lee was, to start, where people, they know that they're Native Americans that are missing, that they know where they came from, and that there's a record, because a lot of these crimes even go unreported. And there's actually a missing murdered Indigenous Women's Day. It is May 5th every year. And I'm hoping that next year, we're going to talk a little next week about where do we go from here. But that's one of the things I hope. The Presbyterian Church actually holds a service on that day to recognize this huge issue on reservations and in urban areas with missing. So, oh my goodness, we're a little bit late, I'm sorry. But next week, where do we go from here? What do we do? We've learned all these things. So I'm hoping I can give you some resources and some ideas that as a congregation we can move forward. Maybe some things that we can delve deeper into, because we've just kind of scratched the surface in these 4 weeks. But for further learning, advocacy, and partnership, where do we go? It's great to learn this, but what do you do with it once you learn it? And so I hope that some of you or all of you will be interested in taking some of those next steps as a group, so that you aren't trying to do it alone. So I have a new blessing this week. This is actually a Navajo prayer, as I walk with beauty. This is Trinity Presbyterian Church in Chinle, Arizona. Wonderful congregation. So this is the one that I picked out for today. As I walk, the universe is walking with me. In beauty, it walks before me. In beauty, it walks behind me. In beauty, it walks below me. In beauty, it walks above me. Beauty is on every side. As I walk with beauty. Thank you, everybody, for coming these 4 weeks. Please come back next week, because I'm really excited about talking with you about where do we head after we've learned everything we've learned. So thank you very much. Hey. What? Oh.
I grabbed a ticket from the tree
Oh.
last week,
Uh-huh.
and I bought the
Stuff?